quiet endings are often the most powerful, not because they are loud or dramatic, but because almost nobody sees them coming. Many people believe an empath reaches their limit through anger, confrontation, or a final emotional explosion. That belief could not be further from the truth. The reality is far more unsettling. The final stage of an empath's patience is so calm, so silent, and so unexpected that most people completely miss the signs. By the time they understand what has happened, the connection they once relied on is already slipping away. What makes this even more fascinating is that empaths are usually the last people anyone expects to walk away. They are known for their understanding nature. They listen longer, forgive more, stay when others would leave. They search for reasons behind people's behavior. They try to see pain beneath harsh words and fear beneath cold actions. While most people judge, empaths try to understand. While most people give up, empaths often give another chance, then another, and another. This is exactly why their patience can seem endless from the outside. Yet beneath that patience, a process is unfolding that very few people ever talk about. It does not happen in a single day. It does not happen after one mistake or one disappointment. Instead, it develops slowly through a series of emotional stages. Each stage changes the empath in ways that are almost invisible to the people around them. What begins as compassion can turn into exhaustion. What begins as hope can turn into acceptance. And what begins as endless understanding can eventually lead to a form of emotional detachment that surprises everyone involved. This final stage is often misunderstood because it does not look like a breaking point at all. In fact, it can look like peace. But beneath that peace lies a powerful decision that has been building for a very long time. In this video, you will discover why empaths stay longer than most people, why they continue giving chances even after being hurt, and why their patience is often mistaken for weakness. You will learn the hidden psychological stages that occur before an empath finally reaches their limit. More importantly, you will understand the subtle signs that reveal when an empath is quietly withdrawing long before they physically leave. The final stage may be the most misunderstood part of human behavior, and by the end of this video, you will see why it changes relationships forever. Stay with us until the end because the last stage is not what most people expect, and understanding it could completely change the way you view empathy, patience, and emotional connection. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy exploring the deeper side of human behavior, psychology, and personal growth, make sure to subscribe and join us for more insights that most people never notice until it is too late. The first stage begins long before anyone notices a problem. In fact, it often starts when the empath is still fully invested in the relationship, friendship, or connection. Contrary to what many people believe, empaths do not stay silent when they are hurt, at least not in the beginning. Their first instinct is usually communication. They want understanding. They want clarity. They want to solve the issue before it grows into something larger. When something hurts them, they do not immediately walk away. They explain it. They talk about it. They try to put their feelings into words. They carefully choose their language because they do not want to create conflict. They do not want to attack anyone. They simply want the other person to understand what is happening beneath the surface. While others may react emotionally, empaths often react thoughtfully. They spend time reflecting on what happened before bringing it up. They replay conversations in their minds. They question their own interpretations. They wonder if they misunderstood something. Then, after giving the situation careful thought, they finally speak up. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume the empath is complaining. They assume the empath is being overly sensitive. They assume the empath is creating problems where none exist. What they fail to see is that the empath is actually trying to protect the relationship. The conversation itself is an act of care. If they did not care, they would not spend so much energy trying to explain their feelings. They would not spend hours searching for the right words. They would not risk vulnerability in the hope of being understood. Yet many people overlook this entirely. Instead of listening to the message, they focus on defending themselves. Instead of hearing the pain, they hear criticism. Instead of seeking understanding, they seek excuses. The empath notices this more than anyone realizes. They notice when their concerns are dismissed. They notice when their feelings are minimized. They notice when the conversation becomes focused on everyone else's emotions except their own. But because they naturally see different perspectives, they often give the benefit of the doubt. They tell themselves that maybe the other person did not understand. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe the explanation was not clear enough. So they try again, and then they try again after that. What makes this stage so important is that hope is still alive. The empath still believes things can improve. They still believe honesty can heal misunderstandings. They still believe that if they explain themselves clearly enough, the other person will finally understand. Psychologically, this makes perfect sense. People with high levels of empathy tend to see potential where others see limitations. They focus on possibilities rather than patterns. They believe people can grow. They believe people can learn. They believe relationships can improve. This optimism becomes both a strength and a weakness. It allows them to remain compassionate during difficult times, but it also keeps them invested long after warning signs appear. They continue communicating because they genuinely believe communication can solve the problem. At this stage, they are not asking for perfection. They are asking to be heard. That simple desire often gets misunderstood. They are not demanding flawless behavior. They are not expecting someone to never make mistakes. They are simply asking for acknowledgement. They want their emotions to matter. They want their experiences to be recognized. They want to know that their pain is not invisible. Yet when those needs continue to go unmet, something subtle begins to shift. The empath starts entering the second stage. This stage is far less visible because it often looks like patience from the outside. The empath continues giving. They continue understanding. They continue supporting. But beneath that kindness, a new pattern begins forming. Instead of expecting accountability from others, they start carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. They become interpreters of other people's behavior. They become translators of other people's emotions. They become experts at explaining why someone acted the way they did. When someone is distant, they assume stress is the reason. When someone becomes cold, they assume fear is involved. When someone becomes neglectful, they search for hidden struggles that might explain it. They tell themselves that perhaps the other person is overwhelmed. Perhaps they are dealing with problems nobody knows about. Perhaps they are carrying emotional wounds from the past. The empath develops an explanation for almost everything. This ability to understand people is often celebrated as a gift, and in many ways it is. The problem appears when understanding replaces boundaries. Instead of asking whether behavior is acceptable, the empath becomes focused on why it happened. Instead of protecting their own emotional well-being, they focus on protecting the emotional well-being of everyone around them. Slowly, they become the emotional caretaker. Without realizing it, they start carrying both sides of the relationship. They manage conflicts. They repair misunderstandings. They create emotional safety. They absorb tension. They smooth over disagreements. They become responsible for keeping everything together. Meanwhile, the other person may not even realize this is happening. The imbalance grows quietly. The empath keeps excusing behavior that would concern most people. They keep finding reasons to stay patient. They keep extending understanding where accountability should exist. Every time disappointment appears, they replace it with another explanation. Every time they feel neglected, they replace hurt with compassion. Every time they feel ignored, they convince themselves there must be a reason. This process can continue for months or even years. The dangerous part is that it often looks noble, it looks mature, it looks compassionate. Yet beneath the surface, emotional exhaustion is slowly developing. Human beings are not designed to endlessly give emotional energy without receiving anything in return. Eventually, even the most compassionate person begins to feel the weight of that imbalance. At first, the signs are small. The empath feels unusually tired after certain conversations. They need more time alone to recover. They begin noticing that some interactions leave them emotionally drained rather than emotionally connected. They cannot always explain why. They simply know that something feels different. This marks the beginning of the third stage. From the outside, almost nothing changes. They still help. They still listen. They still support. They still show up when others need them. They continue fulfilling the same role they have always fulfilled. Because of this, people assume everything is fine. They assume the empath remains as patient as ever. Internally, however, a quiet shift has begun. The empath starts noticing patterns they previously ignored. They notice who calls only when they need something. They notice who disappears when support is required in return. They notice who expects understanding but rarely offers it. They notice who takes emotional energy without ever replenishing it. These observations create a strange emotional conflict. Part of them still wants to believe the best in people. Another part begins recognizing uncomfortable truths. The gap between effort and appreciation becomes harder to ignore. The gap between giving and receiving becomes impossible to overlook. This is where quiet resentment begins. Not explosive resentment, not dramatic resentment, quiet resentment. The kind that grows silently beneath the surface. The empath may never express it openly. In fact, many empaths feel guilty for experiencing it at all. They wonder whether they are being unfair. They question whether their expectations are too high. They criticize themselves for feeling disappointed. Yet the emotion remains, because emotional labor without reciprocity eventually creates emotional fatigue. Every relationship requires effort. Every meaningful connection involves compromise. But when one person consistently becomes the emotional foundation while receiving little support in return, exhaustion becomes unavoidable. The empath begins feeling emotionally alone, even when surrounded by people. That loneliness feels confusing because technically they are connected to others. They have conversations. They spend time together. They remain involved. Yet something essential is missing. They no longer feel understood. They no longer feel emotionally supported. They no longer feel seen. The emotional distance grows little by little. What makes this stage particularly difficult is that nobody else notices it. The empath continues functioning normally. They continue smiling. They continue helping. They continue showing kindness. Meanwhile, a silent calculation is taking place inside their mind. They begin recognizing how much energy they give compared to how much they receive. They begin recognizing how often their needs are postponed. They begin recognizing how frequently their understanding is taken for granted. Many people assume this is the breaking point. It is not. The real turning point comes next. Because eventually the empath reaches a stage that almost nobody recognizes until it is too late. The arguments become less frequent, the discussions become shorter, the requests for change become smaller. Then something surprising happens. They stop arguing altogether, not because the issue disappeared, not because they suddenly became happy, not because everything improved. They stop because they are no longer convinced that change is coming. This is the stage nobody notices. For a long time, their complaints were interpreted as negativity. Their concerns were viewed as overreactions. Their attempts to communicate were dismissed as emotional sensitivity. Now those conversations disappear. Most people see this silence and feel relieved. They assume the problem has finally been resolved. They assume the empath accepted the situation. They assume peace has returned. What they fail to understand is that silence often means something entirely different. Sometimes silence is acceptance, but many times silence is withdrawal. The empath stops defending themselves, stops explaining themselves, stops asking to be understood, stops requesting effort, stops fighting for what once mattered, because deep inside they are beginning to emotionally let go. The loudest warning was never their anger. It was their silence. What happens next is the stage that almost nobody recognizes until it has already happened. The empath who once explained everything becomes quieter. The person who once fought for understanding becomes less interested in being understood. The individual who spent months or years trying to repair the connection slowly stops reaching for it. This is not a sudden decision. It is not an impulsive reaction. It is the result of emotional exhaustion accumulating over a very long period of time. Every ignored conversation, every broken promise, every one-sided effort, every moment of feeling unseen. All of it begins collecting beneath the surface. The empath may not even realize how much emotional weight they have been carrying until one day they notice they are tired in a way that rest cannot fix. This is the final stage of an empath's patience. Many people expect this stage to be dramatic. They expect anger. They expect confrontation. They expect an emotional explosion that announces the end. Instead, what often appears is something much quieter and much more powerful. Emotional detachment. At first, it can be difficult to recognize because the empath may still seem polite. They may still respond to messages. They may still participate in conversations. They may still appear calm on the outside. But internally, a profound shift has already begun. The emotional investment that once fueled the connection is slowly disappearing. The hope that once kept them trying begins fading away. The belief that things will eventually improve no longer feels convincing. For a long time, the empath believed there was still something left to save. Now they begin questioning whether there ever was. This stage often develops after prolonged emotional overload. Human beings have limits, even those with extraordinary patience. Empaths are often known for their ability to absorb emotions, understand pain, and tolerate difficult situations longer than most people. But emotional energy is not unlimited. When someone repeatedly gives support without receiving support in return, eventually their emotional reserves begin running dry. The change is subtle at first. They stop checking their phone as often. They stop wondering why someone has not called. They stop replaying conversations in their head. They stop analyzing every interaction. They stop searching for hidden meanings. These behaviors may seem small, but they represent something significant. For months or years, their attention was focused on maintaining the connection. Now that attention begins returning to themselves. The waiting starts disappearing. Before, they waited for effort. They waited for change. They waited for accountability. They waited for understanding. Now they simply stop waiting. This is often the moment when the emotional bond begins breaking completely. Hope has always been one of the strongest forces keeping the empath invested. As long as hope exists, effort continues. As long as hope exists, patience remains alive. As long as hope exists, another chance always seems possible. But once hope disappears, everything changes. The empath no longer wakes up expecting things to improve. They no longer spend energy imagining better outcomes. They no longer build emotional futures around promises that never become reality. The investment starts fading. This can confuse people because the empath does not necessarily become cruel or hostile. They simply become emotionally unavailable in ways they never were before. Their energy becomes focused elsewhere. Their attention shifts. Their priorities change. The relationship that once occupied so much space in their mind gradually loses importance. What makes this stage so difficult to recognize is that it often looks like peace. The arguments stop. The complaints stop, the emotional reactions stop. Many people interpret this as a positive sign. They assume the empath has finally accepted the situation. They assume the conflict has ended. They assume everything is stable again. In reality, the relationship may already be over inside the empath's mind. Tonal closure often happens long before physical separation. This is one of the least discussed aspects of human relationships. People often think endings occur when someone leaves. They think endings occur when a final conversation takes place. They think endings occur when contact disappears. For the empath, the ending often begins much earlier. It begins the moment they stop believing their efforts matter. It begins the moment they stop expecting reciprocity. It begins the moment they realize they can no longer carry the emotional weight alone. By the time others notice something is wrong, the empath may have already processed much of the loss internally. That is why the final stage feels so different from every stage before it. There is no desire for revenge. There is no need to punish anyone. There is no obsession with proving who was right. There is no endless list of grievances waiting to be expressed. The empath simply becomes detached. For many people, this is difficult to understand because they assume pain automatically creates anger. Yet emotional detachment often develops after anger has already come and gone. The empath may have felt frustration months earlier. They may have felt disappointment countless times. They may have experienced sadness repeatedly. Now they feel something else: acceptance. Not acceptance of the behavior. Not acceptance of the mistreatment. Acceptance of reality. Acceptance that some people do not change. Acceptance that some relationships cannot be repaired by effort alone. Acceptance that understanding someone does not automatically create mutual respect. This acceptance creates emotional distance. And emotional distance changes everything. The most surprising part is what happens next. People often panic too late. For months, years, or even decades, they became accustomed to the empath's patience. They became comfortable with the endless understanding. They relied on the empath's willingness to forgive. They assumed that no matter what happened, the empath would continue showing up. Human beings adapt quickly to consistency. When someone is always available, their presence starts feeling permanent. When someone always forgives, forgiveness starts feeling guaranteed. When someone always stays, staying begins to feel expected. The empath's patience slowly becomes invisible, not because it lacks value, but because people stop noticing what is always there. This psychological pattern appears in many areas of life. People often become aware of value only after they lose access to it. Familiarity creates comfort, and comfort sometimes creates blindness. The support that once felt extraordinary begins feeling normal. The effort that once seemed remarkable begins feeling automatic. The empath keeps giving. Others keep receiving. The cycle continues. Then one day it stops. The calls stop. The check-ins stop. The emotional availability disappears. The willingness to rescue disappears. The endless understanding disappears. The empath who once carried the emotional weight of the relationship quietly sets it down. This is usually the moment panic begins. Suddenly people notice the absence. They notice conversations feel different. They notice responses are shorter. They notice the energy has changed. They notice the warmth is gone. What they often fail to realize is that this change did not happen overnight. It was building for a long time. Every ignored concern contributed to it. Every dismissed feeling contributed to it. Every broken promise contributed to it. Every imbalance contributed to it. Now the consequences are finally visible. The irony is that many people only become motivated to change when they realize access is disappearing. The effort they withheld for years suddenly appears. The attention they failed to give suddenly becomes available. The concern they rarely express suddenly feels urgent. But timing matters. The empath spent a long time fighting for the relationship before reaching this point. They spent a long time communicating. They spent a long time hoping. They spent a long time waiting. Now they are emotionally somewhere else. This creates one of the most misunderstood situations in human behavior. The other person becomes more invested precisely when the empath becomes less invested. One moves closer, the other moves away. One finally sees the value. The other has stopped seeking validation. This is why people often describe the final stage as shocking, not because it happened suddenly, but because they noticed it late. They mistook patience for permanence. They mistook forgiveness for endless tolerance. They mistook understanding for unconditional access. The empath never intended to create this misunderstanding. In many cases, they repeatedly communicated their needs. They repeatedly expressed concerns. They repeatedly tried to prevent this outcome. The warnings were there. The conversations were there. The opportunities for change were there. Yet those moments often seemed less important than they actually were. Now another important distinction begins to emerge. This stage is completely different from anger. Many people confuse the two because both can create distance. Both can create tension. Both can lead to separation. But psychologically, they are very different experiences. Anger still contains emotional attachment. An angry person still cares. An angry person still reacts. An angry person still wants something. Even during arguments, there is often a hidden desire underneath the conflict, a desire to be understood, a desire to be respected, a desire to repair what feels broken. Anger may look harsh, but it often reflects emotional investment. People rarely become angry about things they truly do not care about. The empath understands this, even if only subconsciously. That is why earlier stages often involved frustration. The frustration existed because the connection still mattered. The disappointment existed because expectations still existed. The arguments exist because hopes still existed. Detachment is different. Detachment does not fight. Detachment does not chase. Detachment does not demand. Detachment does not negotiate. When emotional detachment arrives, the need for resolution begins disappearing. The empath no longer feels compelled to convince anyone. They no longer feel responsible for fixing everything. They no longer feel obligated to keep proving their value. The emotional struggle that once consumed their thoughts gradually loses power. This is why detached behavior can seem almost unsettling to those who were accustomed to emotional reactions. There is no dramatic confrontation, no desperate plea, no final battle, just distance, calm distance, quiet distance. The kind of distance that develops after countless attempts have already failed. An angry empath still wants resolution. A detached empath has already found it, and that resolution often happens internally. It happens when they stop measuring their worth through someone else's effort. It happens when they stop waiting for validation. It happens when they stop carrying responsibilities that never belonged to them. It happens when they finally understand that compassion does not require self-sacrifice. By this point, The emotional chapter that once felt impossible to close is already beginning to fade from their mind, even if nobody else has noticed it yet. As we come to the end of this journey, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. An empath does not suddenly wake up one day and decide to stop caring. It is a process, a long and often painful process that unfolds quietly beneath the surface. First, they try to understand, they listen, they communicate. They give chances that most people would never give. Then they begin carrying burdens that were never theirs to carry. They make excuses. They justify behavior. They continue believing that patience, love, and understanding will eventually create change. But over time, the weight becomes heavier. The effort becomes one-sided. The emotional exhaustion begins to grow. Slowly, the empath starts losing pieces of themselves while trying to hold everything together. Then comes the silence. The stage that so many people misunderstand. The stage that often gets mistaken for acceptance. Yet, it is usually something very different. It is the moment when the empath stops fighting battles that no longer have a solution. It is the moment when hope starts fading. It is the moment when they realize that understanding someone does not mean sacrificing themselves for that person. And eventually, after enough disappointment, enough waiting, and enough emotional overload, they reach the final stage. The final stage of an empath's patience is not rage. It is not revenge. It is not bitterness. It is peace. A quiet peace that arrives after countless attempts to make things work. A peace that comes after carrying emotional weight for far too long. A peace that appears when they finally stop trying to convince people of their value. At that point, they no longer chase understanding. They no longer beg to be heard. They no longer spend their energy fixing what others refuse to acknowledge. They simply let go. That is why this stage is so powerful. The person who once gave endless chances suddenly stops needing answers. The person who once waited endlessly suddenly stops waiting. The person who once carried everyone suddenly puts the burden down. And once that happens, there is often no dramatic ending. Just a calm realization that their energy belongs somewhere else. Perhaps the biggest lesson in all of this is that patience should never be mistaken for weakness. Understanding should never be mistaken for unlimited tolerance. And kindness should never be mistaken for permanence. Every empath has a limit. Every patient heart has a boundary. The difference is that their final goodbye often happens long before anyone else realizes it. So if there is one thing to remember from this video, let it be this. The strongest people are not always the loudest. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who quietly decides they deserve better and walks away without needing to prove a single thing. And the moment an empath truly understands that not everyone deserves unlimited access to their compassion, everything changes. If this video gave you a new perspective on empathy, human behavior, and emotional boundaries, take a moment to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed this final stage in someone? Or perhaps experienced it yourself? We would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden psychology of relationships, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the quietest endings reveal the most powerful truths.